The morning of October 15th, 1998, dawned crisp and clear in Millbrook County, Georgia. The kind of autumn day where the air smelled of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the sun filtered through the canopy of oaks and pines that bordered the Whitmore family property. Sarah Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, watching her 8-year-old daughter Emma chase their golden retriever Buster around the backyard. The sight made her smile, even as worry gnawed at the edges of her consciousness like a persistent ache. "Mom, can we go to the lake today?" Emma called through the screen door, her cheeks flushed from running. Behind her, Buster panted happily, his tail wagging in that eternal optimism that only dogs possessed. Before we continue with Sarah's story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and hearing from viewers around the world makes these stories even more meaningful to share. Sarah glanced at the clock above the stove, 9:47 a.m. Her husband David should have been back from his morning run by now. He'd left at 8 sharp, same as every Saturday for the past 5 years, following the trail that wound through the state forest behind their house. The trail that connected to dozens of others, creating a maze of paths that stretched for miles through the Georgia wilderness. "Let me check with your father first, sweetheart," Sarah called back. Though unease was beginning to settle in her stomach like a stone, David was nothing if not punctual. Military training had ingrained that quality so deeply that he still made their bed with hospital corners and could time his morning coffee to the minute. The Whitmore house sat on 12 acres of inherited land, a modest ranch-style home that had belonged to David's grandmother. It was the kind of property that real estate developers drooled over. Prime land, just 40 minutes from Atlanta, with mature trees and a private pond. But David had sworn they'd never sell, not with Emma growing up here, not with all the memories embedded in these Georgia clay foundations. Sarah tried David's cell phone for the 3rd time that morning, listening to it ring endlessly before clicking to voicemail. His voice, calm and measured as always. "You've reached David Whitmore. Leave a message." The beep seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of their kitchen. "Emma, honey, come inside for a minute," Sarah called, her voice carrying a note that made her daughter stop mid-chase. Children had a radar for adult worry, and Emma's expression shifted from playful to concerned as she bounded up the porch steps. "Is something wrong with Daddy?" Emma asked, those wide blue eyes, David's eyes, searching her mother's face for reassurance. "I'm sure he's fine," Sarah said automatically, though the words felt hollow. "He probably just ran into someone on the trail and lost track of time." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew it wasn't true. David didn't lose track of time. David didn't deviate from routines. David especially didn't leave his family wondering where he was. By noon, Sarah had called the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Martinez arrived within 20 minutes. A soft-spoken woman in her 30s who took notes in a small leather notebook and asked gentle but probing questions. Had there been any problems in the marriage? Any financial troubles? Had David seemed different lately, stressed or upset? Sarah found herself defending her husband to a stranger, listing all the reasons why David Whitmore would never simply vanish. He was a devoted father who read Emma bedtime stories every night. He was a reliable employee at the county water treatment facility, never missing a day in 8 years. He was a man who still brought Sarah flowers on their anniversary and never forgot to kiss her goodbye in the mornings. "Sometimes people have reasons we don't see," Deputy Martinez said kindly. "Sometimes they're protecting the ones they love from something they think is dangerous." The search began that afternoon. Volunteers from their Methodist church arrived first, followed by David's co-workers and neighbors Sarah barely knew. They formed search parties with walkie-talkies and bright orange safety vests, spreading out along the network of trails that David knew like the back of his hand. The forest that had always felt like a protective embrace around their property now seemed vast and threatening, full of shadows that could hide anything. Emma insisted on joining the search, despite Sarah's protests. "Daddy taught me to whistle really loud," she said, demonstrating a piercing call that made Buster bark in response. "He'll hear me and come home." The confidence in her voice broke Sarah's heart. As the sun began to set on what should have been an ordinary Saturday, Sarah stood in her living room, surrounded by well-meaning friends and neighbors, all offering theories and comfort in equal measure. Someone had brought a casserole. Someone else had made coffee. The house smelled like a church potluck, filled with the low murmur of adult conversation, punctuated by Emma's occasional questions about when Daddy would be home. Sheriff Patricia Coleman arrived just as the last search party returned, empty-handed. She was a tall woman with prematurely grey hair and the kind of steady presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Sarah had voted for her in the last election, impressed by her 20 years of experience with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sheriff Coleman said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's couch. "I need to ask you some difficult questions, and I want you to know that we're going to do everything possible to find your husband." Sarah nodded. Emma curled against her side like a small, warm anchor to reality. "Has David ever mentioned feeling threatened by anyone? Any problems at work? Any disputes with neighbors?" The sheriff's voice was professional but not unkind. "Nothing like that," Sarah said. "David gets along with everyone. He's—" She searched for the right words. "He's the kind of man who helps strangers change flat tires and never expects anything in return." Sheriff Coleman made notes, her pen scratching softly against the paper. "What about his routine this morning? Did he do anything differently?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying to reconstruct those final ordinary moments. "He made coffee like always, read the newspaper, kissed Emma and me goodbye. He was wearing his blue running shorts and that old army t-shirt with the hole in the shoulder that I keep threatening to throw away." Her voice caught on the last words. "Did he take anything with him? Water bottle, wallet, keys?" "Just his water bottle and house key," Sarah said. "His wallet was still on the dresser when I checked. His car keys were on the kitchen counter." The implications of that detail settled over the room like a heavy blanket. If David had planned to leave voluntarily, he would have taken his wallet. If someone had taken him, they had done it on foot, in the middle of the Georgia wilderness, where no one could hear a struggle. That night, after the volunteers had gone home and Emma had finally fallen asleep, Sarah stood alone in her bedroom, staring at David's side of the bed. His pillow still smelled like his shampoo. His reading glasses sat folded on the nightstand next to a biography of Ulysses Grant that he'd been working through for weeks. Everything was exactly as he'd left it that morning, except for the man himself. She picked up his pillow and held it against her chest, breathing in that familiar scent and trying not to think about all the reasons why a good man might disappear without a trace. The Georgia night pressed against the windows, full of sounds that had never seemed threatening before. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes that had been moving south from the mountains in recent years. Tomorrow, Sheriff Coleman had promised, they would expand the search. They would bring in tracking dogs and maybe even a helicopter if the weather held. They would question everyone who might have seen David on the trail. They would do everything that could be done, but as Sarah finally crawled into bed, still wearing the same clothes she'd put on 12 hours earlier when her biggest worry was whether Emma should wear a jacket to the lake, she couldn't shake the feeling that her husband hadn't simply gotten lost in the woods. Someone who knew these trails as well as David didn't just vanish. And the complete absence of any trace, no dropped water bottle, no torn piece of clothing, no sign of a struggle, suggested something far more deliberate than an accident. The last thing Sarah remembered before exhaustion finally claimed her was the sound of Emma talking in her sleep from the next room, her young voice asking the darkness when Daddy was coming home. The answer to that question would elude them for 27 years. The search for David Whitmore continued for 6 weeks, becoming the largest missing person operation in Millbrook County's history. Volunteers combed every trail, every creek bed, every abandoned hunting cabin within a 20-mile radius. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation sent specialist teams with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Local television stations picked up the story, broadcasting David's photograph and the family's plea for information across the southeast. Sarah took leave from her job at the county library, spending her days coordinating with law enforcement, and her nights holding Emma as her daughter cried herself to sleep. The 8-year-old had stopped asking when Daddy was coming home, but she'd also stopped eating regularly and had developed a habit of standing at the living room window for hours, watching the driveway as if she could will her father's return through sheer determination. "Children are resilient," the grief counselor assured Sarah during one of their twice-weekly sessions. "Emma will adapt. They always do." But Sarah could see the way her daughter's bright spirit was dimming, like a candle slowly burning down to nothing. The theories multiplied as the weeks passed without answers. David had been struggling with depression and taken his own life somewhere in the vast wilderness, except he'd shown no signs of mental illness and had been making plans for Emma's upcoming birthday party. He'd been having an affair and run off with another woman, except forensic accounting showed no unusual withdrawals from their joint accounts and no evidence of secret communications. He'd witnessed something criminal and been eliminated by people who couldn't risk exposure, but what kind of crime could occur in the sleepy trails of Millbrook County? Sheriff Coleman visited the house every Tuesday, sitting at Sarah's kitchen table with coffee and updates that grew progressively more discouraging. The physical search had expanded to cover nearly 50 square miles. Investigators had interviewed over 200 people. David's photograph had been distributed to law enforcement agencies across 3 states, but the Georgia wilderness was vast and unforgiving, and after 6 weeks, even the most optimistic officials were beginning to use phrases like presumed deceased and closure. "I want to show you something," Sheriff Coleman said during her visit in late November, pulling a manila folder from her briefcase. Inside were photographs of the trail where David had been running that morning, taken from various angles and marked with evidence flags that indicated nothing. No footprints in the soft earth beyond David's own Nike treads, no broken branches or disturbed vegetation, no signs that anyone else had been on that particular stretch of trail in recent days. "It's like he'd just stepped off the path and vanished into thin air," the sheriff said, her frustration evident despite her professional demeanor. "I've worked missing person cases for 20 years, Mrs. Whitmore, and I've never seen anything quite like this." Sarah studied the photographs, trying to make sense of the impossible. The trail was bordered by dense forest on both sides, thick with underbrush and brambles that would have torn clothing and left traces of passage. Even if someone had carried David away, which seemed physically unlikely given his 6-foot frame and athletic build, there should have been some evidence of the struggle. "What about his water bottle?" Sarah asked. "Did you ever find it?" Sheriff Coleman shook her head. "That's one of the things that bothers me most. If he'd collapsed from a medical emergency, the bottle would be there. If he'd been attacked, it would have been dropped in the struggle. The fact that it's missing suggests that he walked away from that trail voluntarily," Sarah finished, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. But that explanation created its own problems. David's car was still in their driveway. His wallet was still on their dresser. His life insurance policy was still active, and he'd made no attempts to access their savings or establish credit elsewhere. If he'd planned to disappear, he'd done it without taking any of the resources necessary to start over. The holidays that year were a special kind of torture. Emma went through the motions of Christmas morning, opening presents with mechanical politeness, while Sarah fought back tears. David's stocking hung empty on the mantelpiece, and his chair at the dinner table remained conspicuously vacant. Well-meaning friends and family members offered platitudes about moving forward and finding peace. But Sarah wasn't ready for peace. Peace felt like giving up, and giving up felt like betraying the man who'd kissed her goodbye on what had seemed like just another ordinary morning. January brought a formal declaration that David Whitmore was presumed dead, which triggered a maze of legal proceedings that Sarah navigated with the help of a patient attorney who specialized in cases involving missing spouses. Death certificates required different standards of evidence than criminal convictions, and the state of Georgia was willing to accept that a man who'd vanished without a trace for 4 months was unlikely to be living quietly somewhere else. The life insurance settlement provided financial security, but no emotional relief. Sarah used part of the money to hire a private investigator, a gruff ex-cop named Marcus Webb, who'd made a reputation finding people who didn't want to be found. He spent 3 months re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining evidence, and exploring theories that law enforcement had dismissed. His final report was thorough, professional, and utterly inconclusive. "Your husband didn't run away, Mrs. Whitmore," Webb told her during their last meeting. "Men who abandon their families take cash, credit cards, important documents. They make contact with someone eventually, even if it's just to file for divorce." David Whitmore left no paper trail because he had no opportunity to create one. "Then what happened to him?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Webb leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "In my experience, when someone vanishes this completely, it usually means one of 2 things. Either they're dead, and the body is hidden somewhere we haven't looked, or they're dead, and the body was destroyed." "I know that's not what you want to hear, but—" "No," Sarah interrupted. "It's what I need to hear. I need to know that I'm not crazy for believing that David wouldn't just leave us." The private investigator's conclusion should have provided closure, but instead it left Sarah with a new kind of torment. If David was dead, where was his body? If he'd been murdered, who had done it and why? The questions followed her through the slow process of rebuilding her life, creating a background hum of unresolved grief that colored every interaction, every decision, every moment of supposed normalcy. Emma started 4th grade that fall, and Sarah returned to work at the library, grateful for the routine and the distraction of helping other people find what they were looking for. But the questions never stopped coming from well-meaning patrons who remembered the search. "Have you heard anything new? Are the police still investigating? How are you holding up?" Sarah developed standard responses that satisfied curiosity without inviting deeper conversation, protecting her daughter and herself from the exhausting repetition of their tragedy. Years passed with the peculiar weight that accompanies unresolved loss. Emma grew from a grieving child into a reserved teenager who rarely spoke about her father but kept his photograph on her bedroom dresser. Sarah dated occasionally, tentative relationships that never progressed beyond companionship, because how do you explain to someone new that your heart is still partially occupied by a ghost? The house in Millbrook County became both sanctuary and prison, filled with memories that Sarah couldn't bear to abandon but couldn't fully embrace. Sheriff Coleman retired in 2005, replaced by a younger man who reviewed David's case file with fresh eyes, but reached the same conclusions. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation closed the active investigation in 2007, though they assured Sarah that any new evidence would be thoroughly examined. By 2010, most people in Millbrook County had moved on to more recent tragedies, and David Whitmore's disappearance had faded into local legend, the mystery that proved even good men could vanish without explanation. Sarah might have spent the rest of her life suspended in that limbo between hope and acceptance, if not for a phone call she received on a rainy Tuesday morning in March of 2025. 27 years after her husband had kissed her goodbye and vanished into the Georgia wilderness, someone had finally found something that might provide answers. The voice on the phone belonged to Detective Angela Reyes, a specialist with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Unit. She was calling about a discovery made 2 days earlier in the Okefenokee Swamp, nearly 60 miles south of where David had disappeared. "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Reyes said, her voice carefully professional, "we found a safe that we believe may be connected to your husband's disappearance. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you in person, if that's possible." Sarah set down her coffee cup with hands that had suddenly begun to shake. Emma was 35 now, married with children of her own, living in Savannah where she worked as a pediatric nurse. Sarah had never remarried, never moved away from the house where she'd spent the happiest years of her life and endured the most devastating loss. She'd become the keeper of David's memory, the guardian of a story that had never found its ending. "What kind of safe?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "A large gun safe, partially submerged in mud and badly corroded," Detective Reyes explained. "It was discovered by researchers conducting a wetland survey. We haven't been able to open it yet, but there are some markings on the exterior that suggest it might be relevant to your husband's case." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 27 years pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She'd often wondered if she would live to see this day, if the questions that had haunted her for nearly 3 decades would ever find their answers. Now that the moment had arrived, she found herself terrified of what those answers might contain. "When do you need to see me?" she asked. "As soon as you're able," Detective Reyes said. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand that this might not lead anywhere definitive, but after all these years, you deserve to know what we've found." That afternoon, Sarah made 2 phone calls. The first was to Emma, who listened in stunned silence before promising to drive up from Savannah that evening. The second was to her brother Tom, who'd moved to Florida after retiring, but had always stayed close to the family, particularly after David's disappearance. "I never thought this day would come," Tom said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Sarah? Sometimes the truth is harder to live with than the mystery." Sarah stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where Emma had once chased Buster and asked innocent questions about going to the lake. The golden retriever had been gone for 15 years now, but the memory of that last normal morning remained as vivid as ever. "I have to know," she told her brother. "I can't spend whatever years I have left wondering what happened to him. Emma deserves to know what happened to her father. We all deserve to know." The meeting with Detective Reyes was scheduled for the following morning at the GBI field office in Macon. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind racing through possibilities that ranged from hopeful to horrifying. What if the safe contained evidence that David had been involved in something criminal? What if it held proof that he'd been murdered? What if it contained nothing at all related to his disappearance, just another dead end in a case full of them? Emma arrived at 10 o'clock that evening, her face showing the same mixture of hope and dread that Sarah felt. Mother and daughter sat together in the living room where they'd waited for David to come home 27 years earlier, holding hands and trying to prepare themselves for whatever tomorrow might bring. "I used to dream about this," Emma admitted, her voice soft in the lamplight. "I used to imagine that someday we'd find out what happened to him. But now that it might actually happen, I'm scared." "So am I," Sarah said, "but we'll face it together, just like we've faced everything else." Outside, the Georgia night was alive with the same sounds that had once seemed threatening in those first terrible days after David's disappearance. But now they felt different, not menacing, but expectant, as if the very landscape was holding its breath, waiting to reveal the secrets it had kept buried in the dark water and ancient mud of the Okefenokee swamp. The drive to Macon took 3 hours, through countryside that had changed dramatically since 1998. New subdivisions sprawled where forests had once stood, and shopping centers occupied land that had been farmland when David disappeared. Sarah and Emma made the journey mostly in silence, each lost in her own thoughts as the miles passed beneath them. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation field office was a modern building of glass and concrete that projected authority and competence. Detective Reyes met them in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to grieving families. "Before we go upstairs," Detective Reyes said, "I want to prepare you for what you're going to see. The safe is in very poor condition. It's been submerged in swamp water for an unknown period, and the corrosion is extensive. We're still working on opening it safely, without destroying any potential evidence inside." She led them to an elevator and then down a hallway lined with photographs of Georgia law enforcement officers. The laboratory they entered was bright and sterile, filled with equipment that Sarah didn't recognize, but that suggested serious scientific work was conducted here. The safe sat on a metal examination table, surrounded by cameras and measurement tools. It was larger than Sarah had expected, roughly the size of a small refrigerator, and the rust had eaten through much of its green paint. But even through the corrosion and mud stains, she could make out markings that made her heart race. Carved into the metal, as if someone had used a knife or sharp tool, were the letters DW, followed by a date, 10/15/98. David Whitmore, the morning he disappeared. "Oh, God," Emma whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm for support. Detective Reyes handed Sarah a chair. "I know this is difficult. Take all the time you need." Sarah stared at the rusted metal, trying to process what she was seeing. Someone had carved her husband's initials and the date of his disappearance into this safe, then abandoned it in one of Georgia's most remote wilderness areas. The implications were staggering and terrifying. "Have you been able to determine how long it's been in the swamp?" Sarah asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "The corrosion patterns suggest at least 15 to 20 years, Detective Reyes said, "possibly longer. The Okefenokee is highly acidic, which accelerates metal degradation, but it also preserves organic material extremely well. If there's anything inside—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood that they might be looking at her husband's tomb. A technician approached the table, carrying what looked like a sophisticated cutting tool. "We're ready to attempt entry," he said. "The hinges are completely corroded, so we're going to have to cut through the door. It's going to be loud and create some smoke, so you might want to step back." The cutting process took nearly an hour, with the technician working carefully to avoid damaging whatever might be inside. Sarah and Emma watched from behind a protective barrier, holding hands so tightly that Sarah's fingers went numb. The smell of burning metal filled the laboratory, and sparks flew in brilliant arcs that seemed almost celebratory, as if the safe was releasing 27 years of secrets in a shower of light. When the door finally fell away with a heavy thud, the room went completely silent. Detective Reyes and the technician approached the opening with flashlights and cameras, their movements deliberate and professional. Sarah couldn't see inside from her position, but she could read the expressions on their faces: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been disappointment. "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Reyes said finally, "you should see this." Sarah and Emma approached the table together, steeling themselves for the worst, but the safe didn't contain human remains or evidence of violence. Instead, it held something far more puzzling: stacks of waterproof containers, each one carefully sealed and labeled with dates ranging from 1995 to 1998. Inside the containers were documents, photographs, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. Cameras, recording devices, and notebooks filled with meticulous handwriting that Sarah recognized immediately as her husband's. Detective Reyes opened one of the notebooks, revealing pages of detailed observations about people, vehicles, and activities. Names Sarah didn't recognize were cross-referenced with license plate numbers, addresses, and timestamps. Maps of Millbrook County showed marked locations and travel routes. It was the work of someone conducting extensive surveillance, documenting patterns and behaviors with military precision. "Sarah," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what was Daddy involved in?" Sarah reached for one of the photographs with trembling hands. It showed two men loading boxes into a truck at night, their faces clearly visible in the camera flash. The timestamp indicated it had been taken 3 weeks before David disappeared. She didn't recognize the men, but their activities were clearly meant to be secret. Detective Reyes was examining what appeared to be financial records, bank statements, money transfer receipts, and handwritten notes about cash transactions. "Mrs. Whitmore, did your husband ever mention working with law enforcement? FBI, DEA, anything like that?" "Never," Sarah said, though even as she spoke she was remembering small details that had never seemed significant before. David's occasional unexplained absences, always explained as overtime at the water treatment plant. His new digital camera, which he'd claimed was for taking pictures of Emma, but which he'd treated with unusual care. His insistence that they update their home security system, something he'd never shown interest in before. Another notebook contained what appeared to be a timeline of criminal activities, meticulously documented with dates, locations, and participant names. The handwriting was definitely David's. Sarah had seen it on grocery lists and birthday cards for years, but the content revealed a side of her husband she'd never known existed. "Look at this," the technician said, holding up a small cassette tape. "There are dozens of them, all labeled with dates and initials." Detective Reyes handled the tape carefully, reading the label through a magnifying glass. October 12, 1998. JC and MR delivery confirmation. She looked up at Sarah. "These could be audio recordings of whatever your husband was investigating." The implications were beginning to crystallize into a terrifying possibility. David hadn't disappeared during a routine morning run. He'd been conducting some kind of covert investigation, documenting criminal activity that someone had been willing to kill to protect. The safe wasn't a tomb, it was an insurance policy, hidden evidence that could expose the people responsible for his death. "We need to listen to those tapes," Sarah said, her voice stronger now despite the chaos of emotions churning through her. "We need to know what he was investigating and who he was trying to protect us from." Detective Reyes nodded. "This is going to take time, Mrs. Whitmore. We'll need to process everything carefully, verify the evidence, cross-reference the information with other investigations. But I want you to know that this changes everything about your husband's case. This isn't a missing person investigation anymore. It's a murder investigation," Sarah finished. As they prepared to leave the laboratory, Sarah took one last look at the rusted safe that had preserved her husband's final work for nearly 3 decades. David had known he was in danger. He'd hidden this evidence where no one would think to look for it, in the vast and trackless wilderness of the Okefenokee swamp. He'd protected his family the only way he could, by ensuring that the truth about his death would eventually surface, even if it took 27 years. The drive back to Millbrook County passed in contemplative silence. Emma stayed the night, and they sat together in the living room where they'd once waited for David to come home, trying to process the revelation that he'd been living a double life they never suspected. The man they'd thought they knew, devoted husband, loving father, reliable employee, had also been conducting dangerous surveillance work that had ultimately cost him his life. "Do you think he was working for the government?" Emma asked as they prepared for bed. Sarah considered the question, but she realized it didn't matter. Whether David had been an undercover agent or a private citizen who'd stumbled onto something criminal, the result was the same. He died protecting people he loved from consequences they couldn't have imagined. "I think he was trying to do the right thing," Sarah said finally, "and I think he knew the price he might have to pay for it." That night, Sarah dreamed of David for the first time in years. Not the anguished dreams of loss that had haunted her in the early days after his disappearance, but a peaceful dream where he stood in their kitchen, coffee cup in hand, smiling at her with the same warm expression she remembered from their last morning together. "Thank you for finding me," he said in the dream. "Thank you for never giving up." When Sarah woke, sunlight was streaming through her bedroom windows, and for the first time in 27 years, she felt something that had been missing for so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Hope. Not hope that David would come walking through their door, but hope that justice would finally be served. Hope that the questions that had tormented her family for nearly 3 decades would finally find their answers. Hope that David's sacrifice would mean something. The cassette tapes from the safe would eventually reveal the full scope of David Whitmore's final investigation. But that morning, as Sarah made coffee in the same kitchen where she'd last seen her husband alive, she already knew the most important truth. David hadn't abandoned them. He died trying to protect them, and his love had been strong enough to reach across 27 years to finally bring them the answers they'd always deserved. The first cassette tape Detective Reyes played for Sarah contained 47 minutes of conversations recorded in what sounded like a warehouse or industrial building. The voices belonged to men discussing drug shipments, money laundering, and the elimination of problems, a euphemism that took on terrifying significance when considered alongside David's fate. The recordings were clear enough to identify speakers and would likely be admissible as evidence if the people captured on them were still alive to prosecute. Sarah listened to her husband's investigation unfold through hours of secretly recorded conversations, surveillance notes, and financial documentation that painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal operation centered in rural Georgia. David had somehow infiltrated or observed a drug trafficking network that used the vast wilderness areas around Millbrook County to move product from Florida to markets in Atlanta and beyond. The operation involved dozens of people, including several whose names Sarah recognized from the local community. How did he know to look for this? Detective Reyes wondered as they reviewed David's notes. These aren't the kind of criminals that advertise their activities. Your husband would have needed inside information or remarkable investigative instincts to uncover this network. The answer came in David's own handwriting, found in a journal entry dated 6 months before his disappearance. Saw MR at the water treatment plant after hours again. 3rd time this month. He doesn't work weekends, but his truck was parked by the chemical storage building at 11 p.m. Something doesn't add up. Marcus Riley had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the county water facility where David was employed. According to David's notes, Riley had been using his access to the plant's chemical storage areas to process raw cocaine into powder, taking advantage of the industrial equipment and isolated location to run a sophisticated drug laboratory right under the noses of county officials. David started documenting Riley's activities as a concerned employee, Sarah realized, reading through her husband's methodical observations. But the more he investigated, the bigger the operation became. Riley wasn't working alone. The network included truck drivers who transported drugs along carefully planned routes, corrupt law enforcement officials who provided protection and intelligence, and money launderers who cleaned profits through seemingly legitimate businesses. David had identified at least 15 active participants and documented their roles with the thoroughness of a trained investigator. But David Whitmore wasn't a trained investigator. He was a water treatment technician who'd stumbled onto criminal activity and made the fatal mistake of trying to single-handedly bring down an operation that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. His military background had given him the discipline to conduct surveillance and document evidence, but it hadn't prepared him for the reality of what happened to civilians who threatened organized crime. Detective Reyes had contacted the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, and federal agents were now reviewing David's evidence against their own files on regional drug trafficking. Several of the names in David's notebooks matched suspects in ongoing investigations, and the recordings could provide crucial evidence in cases that had stalled for lack of witnesses willing to testify. "Your husband was essentially working as an unpaid federal informant," Agent Patricia Hawkins explained during a meeting at the GBI field office. "The quality of his documentation is extraordinary. If he'd lived to testify, we could have dismantled this entire network." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Sarah. David had died because he'd been too effective at uncovering the truth. If he'd been less thorough, less dedicated to documenting every detail, he might have been dismissed as a paranoid employee making unfounded accusations. But his military training and natural conscientiousness had produced evidence so compelling that it represented an existential threat to people who'd killed to protect their operation. "Do you know who murdered him?" Emma asked during one of the briefings. She'd taken leave from her nursing job to support her mother through the investigation, and her questions had become increasingly direct as the scope of David's work became clear. Agent Hawkins chose her words carefully. "We have strong suspects based on your father's documentation. Several of the people he was investigating had the means and motive to eliminate him. But proving murder after 27 years without a body or physical evidence from the crime scene presents significant challenges." The investigation had identified Marcus Riley as the most likely suspect in David's death. Riley had died of cancer in 2003, taking whatever knowledge he'd possessed about that October morning to his grave. But his associates were still alive, and David's evidence provided a roadmap for understanding their criminal activities during the late 1990s. James Crawford, a truck driver who'd transported drugs for the network, was arrested at his home in Valdosta on federal trafficking charges. During his interrogation, he admitted to knowledge of David's surveillance activities and confirmed that Riley had been dealing with the problem in the weeks before David disappeared. Riley was scared, Crawford told investigators. Said someone at the plant was asking too many questions, taking pictures. He was talking about shutting down operations and maybe relocating, but there was too much money involved. Too many people depending on the income. Crawford's statement provided crucial corroboration of David's notes, but it fell short of a direct confession to murder. The closest he came to admitting knowledge of David's fate was a cryptic reference to Riley taking care of things, and the observation that problems sometimes got lost in the swamp where nobody would ever find them. Then, the Okefenokee Swamp covered nearly 500,000 acres of southeastern Georgia and northern Florida, a vast wilderness of dark water, floating islands, and impenetrable vegetation. It was an ideal place to dispose of evidence, and searchers in 1998 had barely scratched the surface of areas where a body might have been hidden. If David's remains were in the swamp, they could stay lost forever among the cypress trees and alligators. But Sarah found herself caring less about recovering David's body and more about ensuring that his evidence accomplished what he died trying to achieve. The federal prosecution of the trafficking network was moving forward, with charges filed against 12 suspects ranging from money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder. David's recordings and documentation formed the foundation of the government's case, finally bringing justice for crimes that had gone unpunished for nearly 3 decades. "He did it," Sarah told Emma, as they sat in their lawyer's office, reviewing the civil lawsuit they were filing against the estates of deceased conspirators. "He brought them down, even though it cost him his life." The financial settlements would never compensate for 27 years of unanswered questions, but they represented a form of acknowledgement that David's death hadn't been meaningless. More importantly, the prosecutions had dismantled a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years, preventing future victims and bringing closure to other families who'd lost loved ones to drug-related violence. Sarah had expected that learning the truth about David's death would bring the peace that had eluded her for so long. Instead, she found herself grappling with complex emotions about the man she'd been married to and the secrets he'd kept from her. The David she'd known had been honest to a fault, incapable of deception, even about surprise birthday parties or Christmas presents. Discovering that he'd maintained an extensive covert investigation while maintaining the facade of normal family life forced her to reconsider everything she'd believed about their relationship. "Were there signs I should have noticed?" she asked Dr. Martinez, the therapist who'd been helping her process the revelations about David's double life. "Was I that oblivious to what he was doing?" "Your husband was protecting you," Dr. Martinez pointed out. "He knew that involving you would put you in danger. The deception wasn't about a lack of trust, it was about love." That interpretation helped Sarah reconcile her memories of David with the evidence of his secret activities. The man who'd read bedtime stories to Emma and brought flowers for their anniversary was the same man who'd risked everything to expose dangerous criminals. His deception had been motivated by the same love that had made him such a devoted husband and father. Emma struggled with different questions about her father's legacy. As a healthcare professional who dedicated her career to saving lives, she understood the moral imperative that had driven David to document criminal activity that was destroying communities through drug addiction and violence. But as a daughter who'd grown up without a father, she couldn't entirely forgive his decision to pursue dangerous work without considering the impact on his family. "He could have gone to the police," Emma said during one of their long conversations about David's choices. "He could have turned over what he'd discovered and let professionals handle the investigation." "Maybe he tried," Sarah suggested. "Maybe he didn't know which officials he could trust." David's notes had referenced corruption within local law enforcement, and several deputies had been implicated in providing protection for the trafficking network. In a small county where everyone knew everyone, David might have felt he had no choice but to gather ironclad evidence before making accusations that could have resulted in his death even sooner. The criminal trials began 18 months after the discovery of the safe, generating national media attention as prosecutors presented evidence of a decades-long conspiracy that had corrupted officials and destroyed lives throughout southeastern Georgia. Sarah testified about David's character and the impact of his disappearance, while Emma spoke about growing up without knowing whether her father was dead or had simply abandoned her. The defendants included aging men who'd once been pillars of their communities, business owners, former law enforcement officers, and civic leaders whose respectability had provided perfect cover for criminal activities. Their convictions represented a victory not just for David's memory, but for the principle that justice could prevail even after decades of delay. Marcus Riley Jr., son of the alleged ringleader, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy. During his sentencing hearing, he offered the closest thing to an apology that David's family would ever receive. "I'm sorry for what happened to Mr. Whitmore. He was trying to do the right thing, and my father was scared of losing everything. It doesn't excuse what happened, but I wanted you to know that your husband died for something that mattered." Sarah had waited 27 years to hear those words, an acknowledgement that David's death hadn't been random or meaningless, but the result of his courage in confronting evil. The validation didn't erase her grief, but it transformed it into something more bearable, a sorrow tempered by pride in the man she'd loved and lost. The final chapter of David Whitmore's story began not with his disappearance, but with its resolution. Sarah decided to sell the house in Millbrook County, the place that had been both sanctuary and prison for nearly 3 decades. The new owners were a young couple with children, people who would fill the rooms with laughter and create new memories unburdened by the weight of unresolved tragedy. Emma helped her mother pack David's belongings, items that had remained untouched since 1998, as if he might return at any moment to reclaim them. His reading glasses, his favorite coffee mug, his collection of Civil War histories, possessions that had once felt too sacred to disturb, now seemed ready to find new purposes or peaceful retirement in storage. "What do you want to do with these?" Emma asked, holding up the surveillance photos and notebooks that had been returned to the family after the trials concluded. Sarah considered the question carefully. The evidence had served its purpose, bringing justice for David's death and dismantling the criminal network he'd died trying to expose. But the materials also represented the final months of his life, a record of his dedication to protecting his community, even at tremendous personal cost. "I think they belong in the County Historical Society," Sarah said finally. "Future generations should know that ordinary people sometimes do extraordinary things, even when the cost is unbearable." The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had officially closed David's case as a homicide, though his body was never recovered from the vast wilderness where it had likely been hidden. Sarah found herself surprisingly at peace with that reality. David's true memorial wasn't a gravestone or burial plot, but the convictions of the men who'd killed him, and the knowledge that his sacrifice had prevented others from suffering similar fates. Sarah moved to Savannah to be closer to Emma and her grandchildren, settling into a small house near the historic district where Spanish moss draped the oak trees and the air smelled of salt water instead of Georgia pine. The change of scenery helped her separate David's memory from the geographical location of their tragedy, allowing her to remember their happy years together without the constant reminder of his mysterious disappearance. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sit on her new front porch and think about the morning of October 15th, 1998, when David had kissed her goodbye for the last time. She no longer wondered what had happened to him after he'd left their house, because she finally knew. He'd been murdered by criminals who'd mistaken his dedication for weakness and his love for his family as something they could exploit. But David had been stronger than they'd realized, and smarter than they'd given him credit for. He'd hidden evidence where only chance would reveal it, ensuring that his death would eventually expose the network he'd died trying to bring down. The rusted safe in the Okefenokee swamp had been his final act of love, protection that had reached across 27 years to finally bring his family the truth they'd deserved all along. Emma visited every Sunday, bringing Sarah's grandchildren to play in the small garden behind the house. The children knew stories about their grandfather David, not the tragic details of his death, but the happy memories of a man who'd taught their mother to whistle loudly and read bedtime stories with different voices for every character. They understood that he'd been a hero who'd helped catch bad people, and that understanding seemed sufficient for their young minds. "Do you miss him less now that you know what happened?" Emma asked during one of their Sunday visits. Sarah considered the question, watching her grandchildren chase a butterfly through the flower beds. "I don't miss him less," she said finally, "but I worry about him less. For 27 years, I wondered if he was suffering somewhere, if he'd been hurt and couldn't come home. Now I know that his suffering ended quickly and that he spent his final months trying to protect people. That brings me peace. Well, the truth about David Whitmore's disappearance had taken nearly 3 decades to surface, preserved in a rusted safe hidden in the dark waters of the Georgia wilderness. But the truth had emerged when it mattered most, bringing justice for his murder and validation for the family who'd never stopped believing in his love for them. Sometimes the deepest mysteries find their resolution not through the efforts of investigators or the passage of time, but through the enduring power of evidence hidden by love and revealed by fate. On the anniversary of David's disappearance, Sarah would drive back to Millbrook County and place flowers at the memorial bench the city had installed in his honor. The inscription read simply, "David Whitmore, 1959-1998. He died protecting his community." It wasn't the whole story, but it was enough. A recognition that ordinary people could become heroes through the simple act of refusing to ignore evil, even when confronting it came at the ultimate cost. The mystery that had consumed 27 years of Sarah's life had finally found its resolution, not in the return of the man she'd lost, but in the understanding that his love had been strong enough to reach across decades and bring his family the peace they'd always deserved. David Whitmore had come home at last, not in body but in truth, and that truth had been worth the wait.